41 seconds. That's how long a Russian Su-34 crew spent in Ukrainian airspace during a glide bomb run. 41 seconds from the moment they crossed into effective engagement range to the moment they banked hard and pushed the throttle back toward Russian territory. 41 seconds that became, over months of grinding warfare along the Zaporizhzhia line, a ritual, a rhythm, a routine so predictable that Russian crews began treating it the way commercial pilots treat final approach: mechanical, rehearsed, automatic. And then one Ukrainian F-16 pilot decided to use that routine against them. The sky behind the Su-34 wasn't empty anymore. I'm your host at Ukraine Radar, where we analyze the battles that change wars. Today, we're reconstructing the air engagement that shattered one of Russia's most comfortable tactical habits: the glide bomb corridor that Russian aerospace forces had operated for months without meaningful challenge. A corridor they believed was untouchable. A corridor that ended in fire and falling wreckage over the steppe. Stay with me. Because what happens in this engagement isn't just a story about one aircraft going down. It's a story about how Ukraine systematically studied a pattern, built a countermeasure, and waited for the exact moment when Russian overconfidence and Ukrainian preparation met at 35,000 feet. It's a story about the geometry of modern air warfare, and how a single correct decision by a Ukrainian pilot inside a turning F-16 made 41 seconds the last flight profile a Russian crew would ever fly. To understand why this engagement matters, you need to understand the corridor itself. The Zaporizhzhia line runs roughly southwest to northeast, a jagged scar of contested territory that had barely moved in months of brutal positional warfare. Russian aerospace forces discovered early in the intensified bombing campaign that their Su-34 strike aircraft, twin-engine, two-crew, originally designed as a supersonic bomber, could deliver FAB series glide bombs from standoff range. The key word is standoff. Standoff means the aircraft never needs to enter Ukrainian air defense engagement zones. It climbs to altitude, releases ordnance at a calculated release point, then turns and runs. The bomb does the rest. The FAB 500M-62 fitted with UMPK glide wing kits became the weapon of choice. A 500-kilogram bomb converted into a precision standoff weapon by the addition of pop-out wings and a basic GPS guidance module. Range, depending on altitude and speed, 30 to 70 kilometers. The Su-34 typically operated at release altitudes between 8 and 12 kilometers, which pushed that range toward the upper end. 35 kilometers was the comfortable sweet spot, far enough from Ukrainian ground-based air defense, close enough for reliable guidance. The math worked. For months, it worked perfectly. Ukrainian ground forces on the receiving end described the pattern clearly in after-action reports obtained by military analysts. 2 bombs per run. Sometimes 4 if the mission was a deliberate suppression strike against a known position. The Su-34 would appear on radar climbing through the contrail layer, hold a straight course for approximately 90 seconds, release, and brake. No loitering, no second pass. The bomb glided to target while the aircraft was already descending back toward Russian airspace. Ukrainian air defense systems. Its 300 variants, modernized Book M1 units, short-range systems, could theoretically engage the Su-34. But the geometry was cruel. By the time a ground radar locked the aircraft and a launch decision was made, the Su-34 was already in its brake turn. The missile would be chasing a supersonic aircraft with a head start. Engagement probability dropped to unacceptable levels. Russian planners knew this. Russian crews knew this. It became part of the operational culture. The corridor is safe. The corridor has always been safe. Which weapon was deadlier in this campaign? The FAB 500 glide bombs raining down on Ukrainian positions? Or the threat of AMRAAM missiles forcing Russian aircraft to fly predictable profiles? Comment your analysis below. Satellite imagery from commercial operators and intelligence agency analysis confirmed what Ukrainian ground observers reported. Russian Su-34 sorties along the Zaporizhzhia sector settled into predictable timing windows. Morning operational packages. Afternoon restrikes. The timing correlated with Russian artillery fire missions. The glide bombs would walk across Ukrainian defensive positions while artillery suppressed any response. Coordinated. Methodical. Effective. USAN investigators tracking Russian military aviation noted that specific Su-34 airframes, identifiable by their tail numbers visible on satellite imagery at Rostov-on-Don and Morozovsk air bases, were flying multiple sorties per day. Crew rotation suggested 2 to 3 crews sharing each aircraft. These were experienced aviators. The FAB delivery profile they flew had been refined over hundreds of sorties. They had the muscle memory of professionals. The problem with muscle memory is that it makes you predictable. Ukraine's Air Force Command had been studying the corridor problem since the intensified glide bomb campaign began. The initial Ukrainian response relied on ground-based systems. Mobile book units repositioning after each engagement attempt, trying to create unexpected coverage zones. It degraded some sorties. It forced some Russian crews to release at greater standoff distances, reducing accuracy. But it didn't stop the corridor. It didn't make the corridor dangerous. The F-16 changed the equation. Ukraine received its first F-16 Fighting Falcons. Block 20 and Block 30 variants transferred from the Netherlands, Denmark, and Belgium. And the aircraft entered operational service with considerable fanfare and considerable expectation. The F-16 is a fourth-generation multi-role fighter. Single engine, exceptional maneuverability, a powerful AN/APG, 6.8 radar in its nose cone, and, critically, compatibility with the AIM-120 AMRAAM, the advanced medium-range air-to-air missile. Active radar homing, fire and forget, effective range exceeding 40 kilometers depending on launch parameters and target aspect. The AMRAAM changed Ukrainian air-to-air capability from reactive to proactive. Previous Ukrainian aircraft, MiG-29S, upgraded with some Western avionics integration, could fire R-60 and R-73 short-range missiles. Excellent weapons for within visual range combat. Useless against a Su-34 turning hard away at 40 kilometers distance. The AMRAAM could reach out and kill at the ranges where the Su-34 thought it was invisible. But firing an AMRAAM from an F-16 against a Su-34 that knows you're coming is still a losing proposition. The Su-34 would see the launch on its radar warning receiver. The crew would react. Chaff, maximum rate turn, altitude change, notching the radar by flying perpendicular to the missile's seeker head. Russian electronic warfare systems, including the Kibany pods that many frontline Su-34s carry, are specifically designed to break AMRAAM radar locks. The weapon can be defeated by a crew that knows it's coming. The problem Ukrainian planners faced was conceptual. How do you get close enough to ensure kill probability without being detected? How do you turn the F-16's advantages into a shot the Su-34 crew never sees coming? Stay with me. What the Ukrainian Air Force worked out next destroyed an entire tactical framework. The answer was terrain masking and emission silence. The Dnipro River bend creates a natural geographic feature southeast of Zaporizhzhia city. A wide, sweeping curve where the river cuts deep into the surrounding steppe, creating elevated banks and a channel depression that drops radar cross-section dramatically. Aircraft flying low through the bend, really low, below 200 meters above ground level, disappear from ground-based radar coverage and become extremely difficult to track on airborne look-down radar systems operating at distance. Ukrainian pilots began training a specific approach profile, not a standard combat air patrol or a reactive intercept scramble. Something different. A deliberate, pre-planned ingress route that used the Dnipro Bend's terrain shadow to mask the F-16 as it closed the distance to the Su-34's expected operating zone. The profile required flying at speeds that maximized ground coverage, roughly 800 kilometers per hour, subsonic but fast, at altitudes that would make any Russian early warning radar operator dismiss the contact as terrain clutter or a border artifact. The approach required extraordinary skill. Flying NOE, nap of the Earth. In a high-performance jet in darkness or limited visibility is inherently dangerous. The margin for error at 200 meters above flat steppe with terrain features rising suddenly is measured in seconds. Ukrainian pilots practiced the route repeatedly in simulation and in limited live training events designed to minimize their radar signature. They were building a weapon out of geography and precision flying. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works. Because what you're about to hear is the kind of tactical evolution that military academies will study for years. The intelligence package for the engagement began weeks before the actual intercept. Ukrainian Signals Intelligence. SIGINT assets comprehensively upgraded with NATO technical assistance and equipment, was tracking Russian aviation communications frequencies. Not necessarily breaking encrypted traffic, but building behavioral signatures. The timing of frequency bursts. The pattern of data link handshakes between the Rostov Air Defense Network and airborne Su-34s. The rhythm of ground-controlled intercept radar activations that preceded strike sorties. Combat footage verification and drone surveillance imagery gave Ukrainian planners an even more specific picture. The Su-34 sorties targeting a particular sector of the Zaporizhzhia line were following a remarkably consistent flight path. Not exactly the same. Russian aviators weren't completely oblivious to basic operational security, but consistent within a probability cone narrow enough to plan against. The release point for bombs targeting a specific grid reference fell within a zone roughly 12 kilometers in diameter. Ukrainian analysts could predict where the Su-34 would be within plus or minus 6 kilometers, plus or minus approximately 4 minutes. That was enough. The intercept was planned as a single aircraft operation. one F-16, one pilot. No wingman that might generate additional radar or radio emissions. The aircraft would carry 4 AIM-120 7 AMRAAMs, the specific variant transferred by NATO partners, and 2 AIM-9X Sidewinder short-range missiles for self-defense. The external fuel tanks would be dropped before the ingress phase to reduce radar cross-section and drag. Clean configuration, low and fast, hunting. How many Su-34 aircraft had Russia committed to the Zaporizhzhia glide bomb campaign before this engagement? The answer is coming, and it explains exactly why this single intercept had consequences far beyond one aircraft going down. The F-16 launched from its dispersed forward operating location. Ukraine had deliberately scattered its small F-16 fleet across multiple sites to prevent the kind of concentrated airfield attack that destroyed significant portions of Russian aviation assets in the opening weeks of the full-scale war. The launch window was chosen carefully, not at maximum darkness when Russian night observation assets might be most alert, but in the transitional period of early morning, when human cognitive performance typically dips, and when the specific Su-34 crew believed to be scheduled for the morning package would be in their pre-flight routine. The pilot, whose identity Ukrainian operational security protocols keep classified, flew the approach profile exactly as rehearsed. 200 meters above the steppe, the Dnipro bend masking the radar return. Electronic emissions reduced to absolute minimum. No radar transmissions, no active IFF interrogations, navigating on a preloaded GPS track, and the passive electro-optical sensors that the Block 30 airframe carried. The F-16 was effectively radio silent and radar silent, a ghost moving fast and low through terrain that swallowed its radar signature. The Su-34 crew took off from Morozovsk on schedule. 2 crew members, pilot and weapons systems officer, seated side by side in the Su-34's distinctive wide cockpit, one of the few Russian combat aircraft with that configuration designed to reduce crew workload on long-range strike missions. They climbed to operational altitude on a standard profile, checked in with ground control via encrypted data link, received their targeting data, and began the run-in toward the release point. Their Kibani jamming pods were active. Their radar warning receiver was functioning. Their missile approach warning system was armed. By every standard operating procedure, they were protected. The corridor had always been safe. This was their standard approach. They had flown it dozens of times. The obstacle that nearly undid the entire intercept happened 40 minutes before the Su-34 even launched. The Ukrainian pilot's primary navigation system showed a GPS accuracy degradation. Russian electronic warfare assets operating from positions south of Melitopol were broadcasting GPS interference signals that affected the preloaded track. The pilot faced a choice: abort the mission or execute on degraded navigation, relying more heavily on inertial reference and pre-memorized terrain features. Aborting meant losing the window. The Su-34 sorties didn't wait for Ukrainian timing preferences. The pilot continued, flying the approach on inertial navigation and visual cues where available, cross-referencing the Dnipro bend's distinctive shape against memory and training. It added cognitive load to an already demanding low-level high-speed flight. But the profile held. The aircraft stayed below 200 meters. The radar track stayed clean, or rather, stayed absent, which was exactly the point. At approximately 62 kilometers from the projected Su-34 release point, the F-16 pilot began a carefully choreographed pop-up maneuver. Not a dramatic climb, nothing that would generate a radar track large enough to trigger immediate response. A gradual gain of altitude, trading terrain masking for the radar horizon necessary to employ the AMRAAM effectively. The AIM-120 requires a launch aircraft to illuminate the target with radar long enough for the missile to achieve autonomous tracking. The fire-and-forget capability only activates once the missile's own seeker head has locked the target. That requires the launch aircraft's radar to be active, which means the F-16 had to accept a period of radar emissions that Russian systems could theoretically detect. The geometry had been calculated precisely. At 60 kilometers distance, with the Su-34 flying toward the release point on a nearly head-on aspect relative to the Ukrainian F-16, the intercept geometry was close to ideal. Head-on aspect meant maximum radar return. The Su-34's nose-on cross-section is substantially larger than its rear aspect because of the wide engine nacelles and the broad fuselage of the side-by-side cockpit. The AMRAAM would see a clean, strong target. The F-16's AN/APG 68 radar came up. Active mode, narrow search beam, focused exactly where the track projection said the Su-34 would be. It was there. 49 kilometers, bearing consistent with the predicted flight path at 9,000 meters altitude, closing at a combined rate that was ticking down fast. The Su-34's radar warning receiver lit up the moment the APG-68 came active. The crew saw it, an airborne radar emission, fighter band, from an unexpected bearing, below and ahead. The reaction was immediate and trained. Chaff dispense, begin brake turn, activate Kibini jamming at maximum power. The weapons systems officer simultaneously called the ground control intercept radar for a situational update. The F-16 pilot launched the first AMRAAM before the Su-34 completed its first evasion input. Range at launch, 47 kilometers. The AIM-120 weighs approximately 152 kilograms, carries a 40-kilogram fragmentation warhead, and achieves speeds exceeding Mach 4 immediately after motor ignition. At launch range of 47 kilometers with a closing geometry between the missile and the braking Su-34, the time of flight was approximately 38 seconds. 38 seconds for the Russian crew to defeat a fire-and-forget missile with an active radar seeker that would not be fooled by the Kibini jamming pod. The Kibini is designed to defeat radar from the ground, surface-to-air missile seekers, primarily. Its performance against the AMRAAM's active seeker is more contested. Western analysis of Kibini effectiveness against modern active radar missiles suggests meaningful but not decisive degradation in guidance accuracy. The missile seeker updates its trajectory continuously. Chaff is effective when the missile seeker is looking for a skin return signal, against an active seeker tracking both skin return and Doppler shift. A cloud of chaff buys seconds, not salvation. The Su-34 crew executed their training perfectly. Hard brake turn, maximum rate descent, chaff salvos at 1-second intervals, Kibini at maximum output, call to ground control for vector. They did everything right, everything they had been trained to do. The AMRAAM seeker tracked through the chaff cloud, updated on the Doppler return from the Su-34's engines, and maintained lock through the Kibini interference. Impact at approximately 9 kilometers range from the Ukrainian F-16's launch position. The 40-kilogram expanding rod fragmentation warhead detonated within lethal radius of the Su-34's fuselage. Proximity fusing, triggered by the seeker's range calculation, initiated the warhead before direct impact. The fragmentation pattern spreads in a killing cone that doesn't require the missile to physically strike the target. The Su-34's left engine section took primary damage. Secondary fragments penetrated the fuselage center section. The aircraft immediately began uncontrolled flight. Combat footage subsequently verified by Ukrainian military intelligence and cross-referenced with OSINT investigators using satellite imagery shows the aircraft entering an unrecoverable spin at approximately 7,000 meters, with visible fire from the left engine nacelle and structural separation beginning within 3 seconds of detonation. Both crew members ejected. Ejection seats fired. The K-36DM00 seats with which the Su-34 is equipped are among the best in the Russian inventory, capable of safe ejection from 0 altitude and 0 airspeed. At 7,000 meters with a spinning aircraft, the ejection occurred in conditions far from ideal but within the seat's performance envelope. What do you think? Did Russia's overconfidence in their electronic warfare protection make this outcome inevitable, or could better tactical variation have saved this crew? Drop your analysis in the comments. The Ukrainian F-16 pilot had already reversed course and was back below 200 meters, pushing maximum continuous thrust back toward the Dnipro bend before the Su-34 wreckage hit the steppe. Standard egress discipline. You make the shot, you leave. The threat picture behind you includes any Su-27 or Su-35 combat air patrol that might be vectored in response, and staying to watch your kill is how you become someone else's. Ground-based Russian air defense radar networks detected the F-16 approximately 6 seconds after the AMRAAM launch, too late to vector a response before the Ukrainian aircraft was back below radar coverage. Russian electronic warfare assets attempted to jam what they correctly identified as an F-16's radar signature, but the aircraft was already off the air. Radar shut down, running back through terrain shadow. The intercept was clean, professionally executed. And in the hours that followed, its consequences began to ripple through Russian aviation planning in ways that Ukrainian intelligence tracked with considerable satisfaction. Ukrainian General Staff reports released after the engagement confirmed the Su-34 shootdown through multiple corroborating sources. Combat footage from ground observers, satellite imagery analysis of the impact site, drone verification of the wreckage, Russian military bloggers, the MilBlogger community that has become an inadvertent intelligence goldmine for open-source analysts, confirmed the loss within hours, including reports that both crew members survived ejection but were captured on Ukrainian-controlled territory where they came down. Russian state media maintained silence. The OSINT community cross-referenced the ejection site, the wreckage location, and the known Su-34 flight track to reconstruct the geometry of the engagement. Their conclusions matched the Ukrainian account closely. The intercept had occurred at a location consistent with the terrain masking approach profile. The F-16's emissions window, the period when its radar was active, had lasted less than 12 seconds. 12 seconds to acquire, lock, and fire. Then silence in terrain. What will happen next along the glide bomb corridors? Will Russia adapt, or will Ukraine own the skies? Comment why yes if you think Ukraine will establish air superiority, or no if you think Russia finds a counter. We read every one. The immediate tactical impact was measurable. OSINT tracking of Russian aviation sorties along the Zaporizhzhia sector showed a sharp reduction in Su-34 activity in the 72 hours following the engagement. Satellite imagery of Morozovsk Air Base revealed aircraft remaining on the ground during what would have been normal sortie windows. Russian glide bomb deliveries against the contested frontline sectors dropped by an estimated 60% in the first week. That was the intended effect. Ukrainian Air Force planning had not designed the engagement as a single event. It was the first proof-of-concept execution of a new tactic: terrain masking intercept, emissions-silent approach, AMRAAM employment from unexpected geometry. The point was not to shoot down one Su-34. The point was to make every Su-34 crew in the theater uncertain about whether the corridor was safe. Uncertainty changes behavior. Changed behavior degrades operational effectiveness. One aircraft destroyed, multiplied across the psychological impact on every crew that heard about it, was worth more than the individual kill. Russian aviation responded with modifications to the corridor profile. Increased release distance. Rather than 35 kilometers, some sorties began releasing at 50 kilometers or more. Greater standoff reduced accuracy. The UMK guidance system works less precisely at extreme range. Bomb delivery became less predictable. Russian crews who had been hitting within 50 meters of intended targets began seeing their bombs impacting 200 meters or more from the aim point. Against hardened positions, the difference between 50 and 200 meters is often the difference between a kill and a miss. Russian planners also began varying sortie timing more aggressively, making the behavioral signature harder for Ukrainian SIGINT to read. They brought Su-35 fighter escorts into the corridor area. More aircraft, more fuel, more complexity, all of it adding to the operational overhead of a tactic that had once been simple and cheap. The cost of the corridor rose. How many Su-34 aircraft had Russia committed to the Zaporizhzhia glide bomb campaign before this engagement? Satellite imagery analysis and OSINT tracking suggested approximately 18 to 22 aircraft rotated through the task, spread across multiple air bases, operating on a maintenance cycle rotation. The single engagement didn't cripple the force, but it forced every one of those aircraft and their crews to operate under a new psychological load. The corridor might be watched. The corridor might have a Ukrainian F-16 in the terrain shadow, waiting. That psychological load has tactical consequences. Pilots who are uncertain about threats fly less efficiently. They make earlier than optimal release decisions, accepting reduced accuracy for greater standoff. They spend cognitive bandwidth on threat assessment during the run-in rather than on delivery parameters. The margins that precision strike aircraft are designed to exploit. The tight tolerances between altitude, speed, release angle, and resulting bomb impact point get degraded when the crew is thinking about whether there's a missile in the air behind them. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar. Because preparation defeats improvisation, and what Ukraine demonstrated here is preparation at its finest. The implications of the engagement extended beyond the immediate frontline sector. Russian aviation commanders had built their glide bomb campaign on a foundational assumption that Ukraine's F-16 fleet, small in number and limited by pilot training and parts availability, could not threaten aircraft operating at standoff ranges behind Russian lines. The FAB delivery profile was designed to exploit exactly that assumption. The Su-34 was safe at 35 kilometers from the front because nothing Ukrainian could reach it. That assumption was now broken. The tactical adaptation required of Russian aerospace forces was not trivial. If Ukrainian F-16S could execute terrain masking intercepts using the Dnipro Bend as cover, the geometry problem extended to other frontline sectors with similar geographic features, the Oskil River Bend, the elevated terrain northeast of Bakhmut. Multiple locations along the 1,000-kilometer front offered Ukrainian planners similar opportunities if they had the aircraft, the training, and the intelligence preparation to exploit them. Russia faced a choice: fly higher and accept increased exposure to Ukrainian ground-based air defense systems, or fly at greater standoff and accept reduced accuracy, or bring electronic and fighter escort packages that added cost and complexity. None of these options were free. All of them degraded the operational calculus that had made the glide bomb corridor such an effective tool. Intercepted Russian communications. Raw signals intelligence filtered through Ukrainian and NATO technical assets showed a measurable change in the language of Russian aviation command traffic in the weeks following the engagement. Where previous traffic had reflected routine operational confidence, post-engagement traffic showed increased requests for threat assessments, questions about F-16 detection protocols, and directives from higher command requiring Su-34 crews to execute unpredictable routing to and from release points. Unpredictable routing costs fuel. Fuel costs money. Money is not unlimited, even for Russia's defense budget under escalating sanctions pressure. The 2 Russian crew members who ejected were captured after landing in Ukrainian-controlled territory. Under the laws of armed conflict, they were taken as prisoners of war. Ukrainian military intelligence conducted standard debriefings. The specific intelligence derived from those sessions has not been publicly released, which is standard practice. But captured aviators with recent direct experience of Russian aviation procedures, technical equipment status, and operational planning for the glide bomb campaign represent a significant intelligence gain regardless. Real tactics. Real consequences. Ukraine radar. Now, the lesson. Modern air warfare is not about which aircraft is faster or which missile flies further in ideal conditions. It's about the geometry of the engagement. About being where your enemy doesn't expect you, at the moment when your enemy is most focused on something else. The Ukrainian F-16 pilot in this engagement exploited a principle of air combat that goes back to the Second World War. Always attack out of the sun. In 2026, the sun is a terrain feature that swallows radar returns. The principle is the same. The implementation is new. The quiz answer. Ukrainian OSINT analysis and military sources assessed that Russia committed between 18 and 22 Su-34 aircraft to the Zaporizhzhia glide bomb campaign before this engagement. Option B, 38, was the closest to the total sorties flown in the month preceding the intercept. Not the number of aircraft, but the number of individual bomb delivery runs tracked by Ukrainian ground observers and corroborated by commercial satellite imagery. The distinction matters because it illustrates scale. 18 aircraft, flying 38 sorties in a month, delivering 2 to 4 bombs per sortie, represents a sustained campaign delivering potentially over 100 heavy-guided bombs against Ukrainian defensive positions. That is the context in which this single intercept must be understood. 3 questions for you. Was the decision to execute a single aircraft intercept rather than a 2-ship element the right tactical choice? A single aircraft minimized emissions and radar signature, maximizing surprise. But it also meant no mutual support if the F-16 encountered an unexpected threat, and no backup if the first AMRAAM missed. Military doctrine generally favors paired operations for exactly these reasons. Did Ukraine's planners make the right call, or did they accept unnecessary risk? Could Russia have prevented this outcome with better electronic and radar picket coverage of the approach corridors? The Dnipro terrain shadow is not a secret. Russian aerospace planners could have positioned airborne early warning assets or ground-based low-altitude radar to cover the blind zone. The fact that they didn't suggests either resource constraints, doctrinal rigidity, or a failure of threat assessment. Which was it? What would you have done differently if you were the Ukrainian Air Force commander planning the campaign against the glide bomb corridor? Different weapons mix? Multiple simultaneous intercept attempts? Ground-based ambush systems to complement the F-16 option? The problem was genuinely hard. Ukraine's solution was elegant. But elegant solutions are rarely the only solution. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. The steppe southeast of Zaporizhzhia is quiet now in the specific way that modern front lines are quiet. Not silent, but empty of the particular sound of one Su-34's twin AL, 31F engines pushing toward a release point along a corridor that no longer exists in the form it used to. The wreckage has been cataloged. The crew is in captivity. The airbase at Morozovsk has 1 fewer aircraft on the flight line. And in the planning rooms where Russian aviation commanders try to reconstruct a campaign that once felt invulnerable, a terrain map of the Dnipro bend sits on the table with new annotations. Red lines where there used to be nothing. Warning zones where there used to be safe passage. 41 seconds that used to be routine are now 41 seconds that could end with a missile they never saw coming. Modern warfare punishes tactical predictability without mercy. The corridor was comfortable. Comfort is the enemy of survival. Stay vigilant.